Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I feel fortunate that I've been to all 50 states, but some of them I went to only briefly, like my 18 hours in Alaska. I spent most of it in Anchorage, although did drive a while outside the city to see some of the wonderful scenery. My host at the time was a noted Anchorage newspaper man, and we started the interview downtown. In downtown Anchorage, a beautiful museum dedicated to the history of the 49th state, I walked around with newspaper columnist Mike Dugan from the Anchorage Daily News. We talked about the state, its lifestyle, its traditions, and about the museum. This is quite a building here. We're halfway up a flight of steps, and there's a little observation area here. Looks down on a fountain, a lot of coins being thrown in. One of the things that impresses me, and my listeners know I love to eat, is that this is one of the few museums I've been in which has a nice enough restaurant that people come here just to eat.
Yeah, they've done, the Alaska History of Museum and Art has done a good job with this facility. It's one of the many sort of public buildings that you'll find in Alaska that's a tribute to the Prudhoe Bay oil money. That's where the funds came from to build it. And they've discovered along the way that they have to do a lot of different things to be able to finance the day-to-day operations. And the restaurant's one of those things. And as a matter of fact, if you were up here and you wanted to get married in high style, you could have your wedding reception right here in this atrium.
That's what I've been told. This is kind of a grand staircase. Let's go ahead up the steps. There's so many things I want to ask, and that's the problem with doing a quick visit anywhere. I so often find myself walking into a city and spending the night doing an interview and then leaving, which unfortunately is the case here. Let's start on the downside. What are the misconceptions people in the lower 48 have about Alaska that you'd like to dispel?
Well, I'll tell you this story. When I went outside to college in the late 1960s, people found out I was from Alaska. They immediately started asking me questions like, do you live in an igloo? And being young and naive, I told them the truth, which is, no, I don't. I live in a house. And, proceeded to give them sort of the straight dope about what it's like to live here. And after I began to notice that they went away disappointed, I simply began agreeing. Yes, we do live in an igloo. We have a split-level igloo. We commute to school by a dog sled. And they, not only did they believe it, they went away happy. And I think there's a certain kind of attitude in what we call outside, which is any place that is in Alaska, where people like to think that this is sort of the rugged last bastion of the wilderness. And if you get outside town, you can see where they think that. But most of us live in cities. About 75% of us live in cities. And in places like Anchorage and Fairbanks and Juneau, the life isn't too much different than it is in a similar-sized city anywhere in the United States, except for the weather.
In downtown Anchorage at the beautiful Alaska Museum there, we're talking to Mike Dugan. He is a columnist for the Anchorage Daily News. He writes a column about Alaska and Alaskans. Before the break, we were talking about the travel distance up to Alaska. I mentioned to him that unless you get a globe, it's really difficult to tell where the state is. Sometimes they put it on a different page, and it's hard to tell the proximity of Alaska to the Pacific coast.
You get a map, the typical map of the United States, and you think Alaska was just to the south of Hawaii, which is where they generally put us in. It's a sort of a subtropical kind of place.
But it's really, for example, from the West Coast, time-wise, not that much farther away than going to the East Coast.
A little shorter, I think. If you're flying generally speaking, if you're flying from Seattle to Anchorage, it takes you about 3 hours now. I think it's slightly longer to get from, certainly from Seattle to New York, but even L.A. to New York.
But you have great air connections up here. Now, we are in not quite winter yet. And the temperature this afternoon is around 6 or 7 degrees.
Balmy 6.
But it's not windy. Now, needless to say, your tourist draws, except for winter sports and cross-country skiing, are going to be springtime. In the southern part of Alaska here, how moderate does it get in the good weather season?
Well, when you're in Anchorage, which has what they call a coastal climate, the weather's sort of moderate both ways. So if you get a 70-degree day, for instance, in the summer, it's pretty hot here. But generally speaking, from May on, if you get anything cooler than 50, it's pretty cold. And so most of the temperature here in Anchorage is going to be in that range.
Mike, what paper you work for here, and what is your role as a columnist, commentator?
Yeah, I'm the Metro columnist for the Anchorage Daily News, which means that the slave drivers I work for force me to write 3 columns a week about pretty much anything.
You mentioned the fact that those of us who have not been to Alaska before, and this is my first trip up here, do have those preconceptions that it's an ice box. Canadian friends of mine say the same thing. They resent people saying, how do you ever go outside? It's so darn cold. But the Hilton where I stayed is comparable to any other big city hotel. The downtown is a little bit more intimate because it is not a 250,000 people, but not as big as some areas go. I presume most of the issues politically and otherwise you deal with here are fairly similar to other cities of this size.
Yeah, there are a few differences. We're having a problem right now, for instance, with moose in the downtown areas. They have been wandering around in increasing numbers.
You're not talking about the Moose Lodge here.
No, I'm talking about those big, ugly, ungulate animals that most people are probably familiar with from the beginning of Northern Exposure, that old TV program. But there's an increasing number of automobile accidents where people are hitting moose. They come through and eat people's trees and make them mad. And so there are some sort of peculiarly Alaskan kinds of issues here. Every once in a while a brown bear gets loose in downtown and the police have to shoot it. But the rest of it is all, the municipal politics are all pretty much the same. Zoning and garbage disposal and road maintenance and that kind of stuff.
We're on what you might call the veranda or the mezzanine level of the second level of the museum here. There's a great gallery of photos around here. I always love historic photos. The thing that interested me in talking to someone before we went on the air here is the fact that the city of Anchorage is a new city. We're talking about 1915, so all of the early days, there's photographic evidence of when it was not here at all.
That's right. This was up until actually about 1914. This was an outwash flat of a couple of rivers. And it wasn't until the federal government decided to build a railroad from open water, which in this case is sewered, up to Fairbanks in the interior that this place even existed. And what happened was people who wanted railroad jobs came and squatted down in the mudflats along Ship Creek. And when the government finally decided that was going to be a hazard, they set up and platted a city. And so the city, which originally was called Ship Creek Landing and is now called Anchorage, began officially in 1915. And one of the things you'll notice about it when you come here is that the downtown part is very orderly because it was designed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And it's a straight grid. It's really easy to get around downtown because it's almost impossible to get lost.
Well, now, you may know where I'm going with this, but I noticed last night in the numbering and lettering system, you pay tribute to Washington, D.C. here because there's no J Street. Or did I miss it?
Oh, no, there is no J Street.
Which we don't have in Washington. It goes H-I-K.
Well, part of the theory was that there were so many people of Scandinavian descent here that they wouldn't be able to say J anyway.
They'd say Yay Street.
Yeah, they'd say Yay Street. And so I'm not exactly sure why it doesn't exist, but we've been getting along without it now for a long time.
Well, we have a joke in D.C. We tell people to turn left on J Street and they can't find it. I mentioned to Mike that at one part of the museum, the walls are covered with photos of the original families who settled Alaska.
You're still really pretty well in touch with your history here. My own father, who was born on Douglas Island in 1914, is still alive. And so you can still go and talk to people who remember Anchorage when it was just a bunch of trees and sort of remember the state from an era that's long gone by. And people do, they go down to the Pioneer Home. There are oral histories that have been recorded, and there's still a lot of interest in that early history.
Were there many what we would call Native Americans in this region? Was this a fairly desolate section of coastline, or does some of the heritage go back to that also?
There was this part of Alaska was in the custody of a group of Athabaskan Indians called variously the Tenina and the Denena. There really wasn't a part of the Alaska coast that didn't have Native Americans on it. And the ones on the coast generally did better. The food was more plentiful, the climate was a little bit better, and they had more trading opportunities, and so they generally did better than the interior Indians.
What was the role of the federal government here before Alaskan statehood? Maybe we should spend some time talking about that issue. Obviously, Alaska was very important for natural resources. It was very important for the defense of the U.S. With the evolution of aircraft, Elmendorf Air Force Base. We even see the president refueling here quite often when he goes to Asia. But what precipitated the move from within Alaska to join the Union? And were there people who thought that the state would be better off remaining a territory?
Oh, yeah. There was, as a matter of fact, the newspaper that I work for, the Anchorage Daily News, was founded in part to oppose statehood. The guy who founded it, a guy named Norm Brown, who was a job printer here, thought that statehood wouldn't be a good thing and Alaska would be better off remaining a territory. And so, in part, he founded his newspaper to oppose statehood. And there was some opposition, although at the time of the vote, the Alaskans voted overwhelmingly to become a state, because what their experience was that in order to get anything done in Alaska, you had to get a decision made in Washington, D.C., and that was difficult to do even if there was an opposition to it. It was a long way away, and in those days, pretty much you had to get on an airplane and fly there, a propeller-driven airplane, and fly there, which was an expensive and time-consuming proposition. And they thought that if they got statehood, they'd be able to get more control of their own sort of economic and political destiny. Now, there are people who will today argue that that hasn't happened, that the federal government is still such a big landowner here in Alaska and has so much power that they're still going back hat in hand to Washington, D.C.
Now, this would have been late 50s?
Uh-huh.
It was Alaska, and Hawaii came in, what, same year after?
It was actually a very nearly simultaneous admission. I believe they flipped a coin to decide which would be the 49th state and which would be the 50th. And Alaska won, I guess, because it's the 49th state and Hawaii's the 50th.
But yet, shortly after that, in '64, you had the devastating earthquake here, and I guess you could debate it one way or the other, but one would like to think that a lot of the support you got afterwards was because of the fact you were in the Union. Or maybe it would have been the same had you been only a territory.
Well, at least initially, I think it would have been the same. The response to the initial response to the disaster, a lot of it was the United States military that came in and sort of bailed people out, and I don't think that would have changed. But there were things that people got because Alaska was a state, which are primarily small business loans and other kinds of things that allowed them to rebuild, that I don't think they would have gotten had it been a territory.
Mike, what was that like? I understand that you were not in Anchorage; you were in Fairbanks when the earthquake happened. But we saw coverage of it, and we're walking into yet another area of the museum here. This is interesting because it's a globe. It shows the way the early peoples came across into this area when the Bering Strait, they assume, was frozen over. But what was that like psychologically and in other ways when that quake happened in '64? I mean, we've seen terrible photos of that.
Well, it was, for one thing, it was strong enough to knock me down on the street in Fairbanks 400 miles away. So it was a big shake. But it didn't really, I'm not exactly sure how to explain this. In Anchorage, for instance, it beat the devil out of several parts of town, some of which are now part of the inlet and were never rebuilt. But it didn't really seem to bother the people here that much. They just sort of picked themselves up and kind of continued and
well, maybe dealing with harsh weather hardens a person to adversity.
There's something in that.
If you are a regular listener to American Montage, you know I kind of have a tradition of going to Key West during the Halloween season. The end of October, the beginning of November, we've been up and down Highway 1 in Florida a lot of times. Well, this time I went to another Highway 1, almost as far north as you can go, Anchorage, Alaska. We are the guests of the Anchorage Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Hilton Hotel, and the museum in downtown Anchorage. We're talking to Mike Dugan. He is a columnist for the Anchorage Daily News. Before the break, we had begun to talk about the devastating earthquake that hit the Anchorage and the South Alaska area back in the 1960s, and I continued my conversation with Mike.
Well, now the classic photo we see of, and I'm picturing it in my mind, it's probably somewhere here in the museum, of cars falling into a crack in the street. That was 4th, pretty much the main drag here?
Yeah, 4th Avenue, which was the main commercial street, I think, even at that time, was hit pretty hard. It was built primarily over a substance called bootlegger's clay, which liquefied, and buildings just literally fell into the street. Streets cracked, streets dropped, cars fell, facades of buildings fell. It was a heck of a mess by the time it was done.
And it looks as if some of the buildings literally, as you say, fell straight down, as if the ground just gave way from under it.
Mm-hmm. That seems to be the case. In fact, there are a couple of buildings now that are built in what they think are heavily earthquake damage prone areas that are built basically to do just that.
I got distracted as we were talking. There's a beautiful miniature here. I've always envied, for example, in D.C., the Smithsonian, some of the people who build those exhibits are absolute artists. Here we have a representation of Eskimos at the end of a whale hunt, pulling a whale up onto the shore. It's in snow. The figures are probably 2.5, 3 inches tall at most. Just a gorgeous little piece of work. What kind of comments do you get, particularly from children who come through this museum? I know there are a lot of, I'm sure, grade school and high school tours come through here to look back and realize that this is the way it once was here.
Well, kids love this kind of stuff because it, I think, kind of gives them an idea of what life was like before they were around. And I've noticed, for instance, here that little kids like this because there's blood on the whale. You know, I mean, that's the kind of thing. But in sort of attempting to represent what life used to be like here, there's a lot of different ways you could have done it, and I think that you'll find farther on, for instance, there are exhibits.
Okay, let's walk a little farther here.
You know, of arrowheads and harpoon heads and the rest of that, all of which are great. But these little dioramas, I guess they're called, really speak to kids in a big way because it lets them look right at something and see what it was like.
Oh boy, look at this.
Yeah.
Here is the inside of, would you call this a hut? Thatch.
This is, I think, one of the old semi-underground houses that were built as a winter habitation. I think this is an alley-oot.
Yeah, an alley, and this is, I will say for radio, this is life-size, and we're able to look in it with a huge sheet of plexiglass over the front. It lets you get right up to it, but you can't touch the exhibit itself.
Yeah, this is the way folks used to live out in the Aleutians, where they didn't have much wood to build with, and where the winds are so strong that literally it rains sideways out there and snows sideways. And so they built these semi-underground dwellings as a way to deal with the wind and lived in them. And these replicas are all as authentic, I think, as they can make them.
Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful work. To digress a little bit, we were talking about how young people, of course, do not have a concept of what went before them. It's like explaining to a young child what it was like when you and I heard that John Kennedy was shot.
Right.
Unless you were there, it doesn't mean anything. It's ancient history. But even in the Midwest, there were parts of America which did not have electricity until after World War II. What was it like up here? You still, I guess, have a lot of small places where they have to generate with small plants their own electricity. Are there still places out in Alaska where all of that infrastructure isn't yet?
Well, there's a lot of places in which, for instance, they don't have functioning water and sewer systems. And villages in particular where they get their water from either from the river or from a central watering point where they where they deal with sort of human waste with what they call honey buckets, which are essentially containers that they carry out. There are some places which are the electricity they have is sort of generator driven, so they're paying tremendous prices for fuel oil. It's expensive and difficult if you live outside the urban centers in Alaska.
You know, I'm trying not to laugh here, but in the midst of all of this, and I'm certain someone might have to explain to a small child that in this Aleut house, that smoke alarm up there is not standard equipment.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they
should
had
have painted
those,
it brown or something.
Yeah, I'm not sure they had those smoke alarms
and sprinkler systems.
Yeah, and the sprinkler systems. But I expect the museum's got a ton of money invested in this.
Now, there's a large exhibit back here again, life size of two people in a, I guess you'd call it a kayak. It's all sealed. Obviously, one's holding a spear. They're hunting some form of waterborne fish or mammal. And I shouldn't ask this right after this wonderful lunch you guys served of salmon. Fishing is still a major part of what Alaska's about, is it not?
Yeah, fishing's one of the biggest employers in the state. It employs not just fishermen, but thousands of people in the summer in processing plants. Used to be all canneries, now in sort of more increasingly freezer plants. But in terms of just numbers, it's a big employer, and it's an important part of the economy.
Mike, I've got so many questions I want to ask. I was noticing in the Alaska Airlines timetable that there are several cities in Russia which are now served from here. Obviously, geographically, this was all one part of land at one time. It was the Russians who sold Alaska to the United States in what was called Seward's Folly. Secretary of State at the time?
Yeah, William Seward.
And they said, who'd want to live up in that icebox? Are we seeing much closer ties now with the people on the other side of the strait, if for no other reason than just the easings in the Soviet Union? And how important commercially do you see that coming to you?
Well, it's since what they call the melting of the ice curtain, which would have happened roughly in 1989, there's been a lot more travel back and forth between the Russian Far East and Alaska. And we are sort of their access to the West. And so there are cooperative agreements between universities. There are commercial ventures going on back and forth.
Well, if nothing else, a common heritage.
Right, and there is particularly among the native peoples a common heritage. So there's a lot of close ties. But the fact of the matter is that in terms of direct trade, they produce about the same things we do. And they're looking more towards places like Japan, which need raw materials. And in fact, in some cases, fishing is an example, they're competing with Alaska. So it's a mixed blessing for us.
But in some aspect, would you say in a way it's more just symbolic and friendly more than anything else, more than being essential? It's about time we did this?
Oh, yeah. And the Russians, the experience for Alaskans going to Russia has just been terrific. People come back with what is a well-known malady here called Russia fever. They go over and just fall in love with the people. I was over in Magadan, I guess, in 1993 and had a terrific time. And so on a person-to-person level, it's really been a wonderful experience.
Well, Mike Dugan, here we are in a more modern times exhibit. We're getting into some photographic areas. Boy, this is something here. I wish it were television because I could better describe this. It shows an early highway intended for automobiles that I wouldn't even want to try that in a four-wheel drive. It's just a rut up through the mountains.
It's the Valdez Fairbanks Trail, which is now called the Richardson Highway, and it was built by the military to link the fort at Valdez with the fort actually at Eagle, Alaska. And they got about halfway up there and they discovered gold in Fairbanks around the turn of the century, and they diverted it and ran it to Fairbanks. And this is sort of a primitive version, and actually a lot of the trails here are fairly primitive still.
Well, I hear this exhibit shows the importance of the railroad, as you just mentioned, and also here's an early seaplane. It's a biplane with pontoons on the bottom. I know a lot of people see seaplanes and can't figure out why. For example, you look at LaGuardia Airport in New York. which still has what's called the marine terminal section. Years ago, it was much easier to land on water than it was to build a long runway.
Yeah, and particularly in southeast Alaska, it's only fairly recently that the commercial aircraft haven't been seaplanes. And the same thing is true here for light planes. You'll see in the summer a lot of people operate on floats because they can find a lake to set down in where they can't find a runway.
I would take it a lot of Alaskans own aircraft.
Yeah, this is one of the sort of per capita, I think, the flyingest place in the nation because the distances are pretty great here and there aren't a lot of roads. The story here is that there are two highways, one which runs from Anchorage to Fairbanks and the other that runs from Fairbanks to Anchorage. And that's about the extent of it.
Mike, over here, some great photos of railroad construction, building a bridge across a huge gorge. And there's also, this is called a snow shed. It's a man-made kind of well, I guess the only thing I could compare it to would be a covered bridge in the Midwest to keep what? The avalanche of snow off the railroad tracks? It's a long garage almost.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's actually a sort of a snow diverter. In avalanche chutes where they didn't have a chance to do anything about it or build away from it, they'd put one of these up so that when an avalanche happened, the snow would go sort of over the tracks.
Kind of skip across.
Right.
Yeah,
and they'd still be able to run the trains underneath.
Yeah, you can't dismiss the importance of the railroad. Is it true that on the Trans-Alaska Railroad, it kind of stops by request? Can you explain how that works?
It's called a flag stop, and basically there are a lot of people who live along the railroad route who have no other access. And so if you're living out there in a cabin and you need to go to town for something, what you do is you walk out to the tracks. You've got a schedule so you know when the train's supposed to be coming by, and flag it down. And if you flag it down, they stop, you get on. It goes on.
How about that? We were talking about transportation there, some great photographs. There is, of course, Elmendorf Air Force Base here, and Merrill Field was the original civilian airport. How new is the international airport here?
The international airport was opened in the mid-50s, I guess. Is
right before statehood, then?
Right before statehood, and has been expanded ever since. And it is sort of an important part both of the state's history and the city's history and its economy. At one time, if you were flying over the pole between the United States and Europe or United States and Asia, you stopped here. Since they've built sort of higher capacity 747s primarily to take people, it's since become a freight center. Federal Express has a big operation here, and what they're doing is consolidating loads and transshipping freight between the United States and Asia. So it's always been a fairly big deal. And of course, the military bases were important during the Second World War as both because the Japanese had invaded the Aleutians and as staging areas for the Lend-Lease program to Russia.
Also, I would presume during the Cold War, strategically, it was very important to have your eyes and ears open here.
Yeah, in fact, there's a couple of bases where they were running out in the Aleutians at Shimya in particular, where they were running fairly routine reconnaissance of eastern Russia.
Mike, here's a copy of the newspaper. This is an extra edition of the Anchorage Daily Times, and this is Monday, June 30th, 1958, with a huge headline. It says, "We're in."
Yep, this is the paper that was issued as an extra after Congress approved statehood for Alaska, and it's a famous headline here in the state. The newspaper itself, the Times, is no longer in business, but it was. It and its publisher, Bob Atwood, were big supporters of statehood, and so when they finally got what they wanted, they really blew it out big, as you can see. And next to it here are the signatures of the people who wrote the Alaska Constitution, and if I'm not mistaken, my dad is right there.
Well, look at that. James P. Dugan.
Yeah, he was a member of the Constitutional Convention. One of the things that the people here in the state did before getting admitted to the Union was to write a constitution and approve it. And it was at the time thought to be a model document, and still is.
So many other things to talk about in the few minutes remaining. I want to get over here to a whole section that deals with the industry. Oh, look at this beautiful old Royal manual typewriter. Who was Howard Rock?
Howard Rock was an Alaska Native newspaper man.
Because his name is here on the typewriter.
Who founded a newspaper called the Tundra Times. And it was set up primarily to champion Native rights. And among those were, for instance, the Land Claims Settlement Act that passed, that established the 13 Native regional corporations. And he is a famous figure among Alaska Natives.
We're going through the Anchorage Museum with Mike Dugan, a newspaper columnist, and we came upon an exhibit that looks at modern-day Alaska.
Finally, coming out of the wall here is, I presume, a replica of a section of the Alaska pipeline. It's, what, about 3 feet, 3.5 feet in diameter?
48-inch pipe, as I recall, yeah.
Let's go ahead and we'll get around over here on the section. Is it an oversimplification to say the oil's in the north, the transportation's in the south, you got to get the oil down here?
No, that's exactly the case. They were unable to figure out any way to be able to get shipping up to the anywhere near the Prudhoe Bay oil field, and what they decided to do was to build a pipeline to open water. And they picked Valdez as the place to do that, and so they built it essentially the entire length of Alaska.
This is I can't imagine how much per yard this pipe costs. It's a heavy pipe, about 3/4 of an inch thick, with fiberglass insulation around it, and then metal around it, and then it sits inside another metal tube on heavy I-beams with supports. I don't know whether those are fins for heat dissipation or what, but this is not just a pipe. The pipe is not buried. For one thing, it sits above ground, right?
Yeah, most of it is built above ground. There are some sections that are buried. Well, you have to remember that this pipeline cost more than the state of Alaska. That Seward paid $7.2 million for Alaska, and the pipeline cost, there have been varying estimates, but the consensus is somewhere around $9 billion.
Obviously, there's a lot of oil up there.
Yep, largest oil field in North America, and a lot of oil that's been discovered and not produced, and everybody expects a lot of oil still to be discovered.
Mike, final thing. Here we are, as I say, approaching winter. Most people are maybe planning their spring, their summer vacation coming up. It would take 6 hours to answer this effectively, but what is there to see? Why come to Alaska? What are the draws up here?
Well, I think,
other than incredible scenery, then I've only been here a few hours.
I think that Alaska, in addition to the fact that it's got more beautiful places than any place else I've ever been, has got kind of a unique history and lifestyle. If you think of it as being able to go visit San Francisco in 1905, in a way, it's exactly, it's sort of like that. Not so much because the buildings are different or the automobiles are different, but because the people are different. And so it's really a chance to visit, in some ways, a part of America's past, and there just aren't very many places you can do that.
Well, Mike Dugan, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk. I promise I'm going to come back sometime. It's not just going to be an overnight. I'd like to take the passage on the cruise ship and come up the coast. Maybe I hear that's dynamite.
Oh, heck yes. And besides, you've never been to Alaska unless you've caught a salmon.
That's true. Michael, thank you.
Thanks.
I probably saw less than 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/2 of 1% of Alaska, but even that was pretty darned amazing. Alaska, the 49th state, and I finally did get to all 50. I'm Dennis Daly.